We find ourselves in an era where we are given countless opportunities to be voyeurs in the lives of others. Whether it be social media outlets, the internet, or television, the invitation to passively engage is before us. Shows like Intervention, Dateline, Hoarders, and the Kardashians sadly celebrate the fall of others who are either so bold or attention-starved to showcase their failings in the limelight. What is it about the human soul that would draw us into such exploits? Perhaps the exhibition of others' vulnerabilities reinforces a sense of superiority within us. Maybe it's curiosity, or quite possibly we crave to be so authentic about our own mess that we find comfort in sharing in the mess of others in such a safe way. Unfortunately, because we have disengaged and huddled into clusters of haves and have-nots, of sinners and saints, these popular media images have done nothing more than create and reinforce in our minds narratives about those other people, whoever they may be. Negative or degrading narratives subtly vilify those living at more than an arm's length, further justifying the need to stick with our own. A few years ago, a local community near my hometown was under fire for creating roadblocks that prohibited city buses from entering popular shopping locations in the area. The city council seemed willing to give up millions in federal highway funds to keep the buses, filled largely with racial and ethnic minorities, out. What narratives about the bus riders did the council and its constituents hold so tightly to that they were willing to face such penalties? Did they personally know anyone that rode public transportation every day? For those who have the resources to choose where they can live, work, go to school, and play, what's reinforced is a sense of safety and opportunity to prosper. The attainment of the American dream can offer a covering, a blinding illusion of self-sufficiency, and a subtle protective veneer of self-righteousness. In contrast, vulnerabilities are exposed in neighborhoods where survival is a way of life and helping institutions parachute in. Without sufficient resources to provide for myself, I must barter and seek help from friends or family, engage social services, or resort to crime. The need to seek out help for my very sustenance demands exposure of my weakness, one that I either contributed to or inherited. After serving nearly 20 years in the state prison, William experienced the deep and abiding presence of God and began to embody the notion of a new birth. Through the power of God and a new support system, William was granted the opportunity to rebuild his life through work, family, volunteerism, and pastoral ministry. As William, an African-American guest preacher, stood before an all-white assembly, his words and personal story riveted the audience. A pivotal phrase in the climax of his sermon sparked a long pause and set the tone for many radical relationships that would soon ensue between the members of that congregation and those who were formerly outsiders. Referring to his past and label of ex-offender that had been placed on him, William said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we all have an ex. Mine, however, has been exposed." Even a momentary revelation of this real truth that we all stumble in significant ways and desperately need both a full measure of God's grace and authentic fellowship with one another can be enough to propel relational reconciliation. On the other hand, as we further isolate ourselves into protective bubbles, what we may not completely recognize is this cocooning has weighty implications on the legitimacy of our faith and the well-being of our communities. If we are sincere about wanting to create healthy and thriving communities for all, we mustn't look far to recognize that apathy, bias, and judgment perpetuate such pervasive poverty. The question remains, are there specific radical relationships that Christ followers are called to pursue? And is this call merely an optional invitation or vital? Is it global and general or specific to each and every one of us? It's hard to dispute the clarity of the answer to those questions found in Matthew 25, yet maybe some of us have missed the gift embedded there. And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did to me." This all-familiar passage has traveled with me through years of sermons and illustrations, reminding me of my Christian commitment to those who are poor, in need, or outcast. Between my fallen condition and society's reinforcements to make life all about myself, I'm grateful for the reminder to do for others. What I failed to realize, however, was a subtle lie that had been planted in my heart in the midst of such powerful truth. The truth. We are designed to serve one another, being especially mindful of the least. The lie. The poor, the outcast, the imprisoned are less than you. Countless times, I've claimed that all people are image bearers of Christ, yet in the ugly parts of my heart, I can think I am better than people living on the streets, incarcerated, or impoverished. Class, material means, and privilege has a way of seeding and reaping pride, often unconsciously. In reality, I would propose that Jesus' reference to the least of these was rather an indictment on a religious and political system that was willing to throw away the sons and daughters of God. Jesus intentionally pursued relationships with and shared powerful parables about the outcasts of society. Such encounters were not coincidental and perhaps hold even deeper meaning than we realize. What if radical relationships across socioeconomic lines isn't solely about doing for others because it's the right thing to do or because it's our biblical mandate? What if it's not just about the privileged doing for the least? What if God designed us to experience a side of his grace only found in a dynamic relationship with those society has marginalized? What if God, in his mercy, loves us so much to reveal our own brokenness through the very ones we thought were broken? The tapestry of a neighborhood that tells a story of pain is also one that creates a vulnerability and authenticity that paves the way for God to showcase his great work. All of this strengthens and deepens my faith. A call to radical relationship will never be sustained by duty or self-righteous pride. It's an invitation into God's joy and his glory. So why am I saying all of this? Many of us have spent years or decades working to fight poverty in our communities. There's no question that in America, our methods of poverty alleviation have been dysfunctional and must change. In fact, I believe this so much, I helped co-found Think Tank nearly 14 years ago to connect effective methods of poverty alleviation with those working on the front lines. Perhaps it will be this generation that works to reshape our culture of helping. So the way that we go about the work of poverty alleviation matters. Jesus led us not only through his message, but also through his methods. Methods, the way we do things, matter. However, I remain convinced that the larger threat to the American church, rendering her ineffective in pursuit of a transformative action, is not poor method of poverty alleviation. The larger threat is our own tendency towards comfort and hubris. We must anticipate and plan to counterattack the temptation to hearken back to areas of comfort, relationships of ease, and places of familiarity. We must recognize the need to change our context, to be present in places we've written off or those that have been invisible to us. Also, we must call out our shadow self, one that gravitates towards attitudes of superiority. Let's remember that hubris can be subtle and is not always evident through loud or obvious actions. It can even be found in our temptation to withdraw from complexity inherent in issues of injustice because we'd rather maintain control or avoid incompetency. Church, we have the power of the Holy Spirit, and we can remain faithful on this journey. This includes all of us. This work is not confined to pastors, ministry leaders, or social workers. It's not the box of your prescribed role that matters, it's your presence. God doesn't gift and groom us to be CEOs, salespeople, manufacturing workers, or teachers to hoard our experience. These experiences have equipped each of us for a role and relationship with our community. So what does this look like? I'd like to take a moment now to share some hope and encouragement through a parable. This is a compilation of stories from several churches that made the bold move to embrace their own poverty in order to become the presence of God's love in their community. New Hope Church had been involved in global missions for decades. God called them to bring the good news to the ends of the earth, yet oftentimes they lived in the tension of not knowing exactly what to do to build his kingdom in their own Jerusalem. Their community was like many others, plagued with pockets of economic poverty and disparity. New Hope saw the tangible needs of families living in their community. There was violence, hunger, unemployment, and hopelessness. Now, the members of that church knew that Jesus often fed the hungry, so they would do that too. They started a food and clothing pantry. They worked hard to put together school supplies in the fall and adopt families for the holidays. They provided material things that families needed. However, they began to notice that although people were getting groceries, school supplies, and Christmas presents, no lasting change had taken place. In fact, their own sense of pride and superiority began to grow, and they became frustrated. Maybe they just weren't seeing the whole picture. Awakened by a desire to go deeper, small groups and adult Bible studies began consuming scripture, reading books, and spending time in prayer to hear from the Lord. They began to learn that poverty was more than a lack of material resources and understand that people were meant to thrive in the context of community. They realized if they were to address spiritual, material, and other types of poverty, they had to humble themselves and learn to form new relationships. As they reflected on their current reality, they realized it was not new programming they needed. In fact, what they really needed was to figure out how to listen. Listening first was like exercising a new muscle. Conditioned to want to jump in and fix, listening forced a new discipline and honest reflection. But through the process, they began to see the work of poverty alleviation as a form of holy currency exchange. They realized those coming to their food pantry, participating in other material relief ministry, and new neighbors who joined the church had a lot to teach the members of New Hope about the work of God's grace and real faith in the midst of hardship. Through initiating new conversations, New Hope learned a lot about their community. Previously, New Hope had never asked their neighbors what they cared about or attempted to see how they might join the work that God was doing through people and organizations outside their church's walls. One thing they discovered was that a local neighborhood association was going to sponsor a series of summer events to help keep youth off the streets and out of trouble. New Hope was honored to join the neighborhood association in support of their community initiatives, using their gifts to come alongside the association's vision. The pastor began to preach a sermon series on the early church and the way it learned how to partner with others outside the Jewish community as the church expanded. New Hope was showing signs of growth in their ability and commitment to partner outside their church walls. However, as the members of New Hope began involved in partnering with the neighborhood association, the noble ambition of coming alongside others in humility quickly faded as two cultures collided. Several of New Hope's volunteers were retired CEOs, teachers, and those with military experience. They'd been trained to plan well in advance and usually either had a network or the personal finances to pull off any event or initiative they'd been a part of. The neighborhood association seemed to operate off a different culture. They didn't plan as far in advance and often either had too many chiefs or no apparent leadership at all. New Hope's volunteers became frustrated with the organic and seemingly disorganized state of affairs and discussed offering to take over the summer events. However, they realized the goal was the relationship and not the so-called success of the event or program as they had defined it. Over time and frequent contact, New Hope began to develop trust as they allowed themselves to be teachable. And by example, their neighbors consistently reminded them that relationships were more important than numbers or achievements. Through New Hope's steady presence to care about what their neighbors cared about, their church slowly was being reshaped in amazing ways. While a lot of energy at the church went into weekly services, New Hope realized that relationships most often were happening outside church hours. When a need would arise, a family needing support during a court trial or a child needing a mentor, people were stepping up to help. When a young entrepreneur needed access to a business loan or training, a seasoned business owner was there to offer counsel and social capital. What they quickly learned was that despite different physical needs, their neighbors had the same core need they did: connection. I began this talk with a vulnerable admission of my own pride and tendency towards isolation. As I conclude, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. I'd like you to pull out your phones and scroll through your list of friends on social media. Then take some time to scan your calendar over the past month. After doing so, ask yourself the following questions. Am I intentionally and consistently pursuing relationships with people outside my circle of comfort? Have I allowed myself to become isolated and prideful, or am I experiencing the joy that comes from the beautiful and messy journey of radical relationships for the sake of the kingdom? Lord, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.